You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
David Pepper, author of Laboratories of Autocracy, he spent, at least a decade trying to turn all of our attention to state capitals where, unseen by most of us, partisan legislatures were doing great damage to the democracy. It's a powerful and important book, and if you haven't read it, read it. But as David is the first to admit, it's also a bit dark, when that doesn't really square with his own optimism that we have the power to save the democracy we love. So he wrote a new book, Saving Democracy, to celebrate what people are doing to fight back and to provide everybody else with a user's manual about how to get involved. David, welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Hey, before we get into your book and other topics, I just saw a piece of news that I want to get your take on, because I know you're thinking about how business should change its mind and start supporting the democracy again. There are, Nazi wannabes, people dressed in Nazi regalia now, protesting in front of Disney World in Florida. So families with their kids who want to go in and see Mickey and Minnie have to see, Adolf and the rest of them on their way in. And it just makes me sick. And I just want to offer that up as an opportunity for you to tell everybody, what should business really be doing here?
Yeah, I hadn't seen that specific, but this is the pattern that we are seeing, the nonstop really attack on mainstream values. It's by right-wing extremists. I go through this in this new book. I just did a whiteboard on this. I just did a newsletter on this. We've got too many businesses, and Disney, I give them a lot of credit. They're fighting back. But too many businesses, and Disney started out doing it this way, and I think has figured it out, something everyone else has to figure out. They're giving money to extremists in these legislatures. And they're doing it because they're just doing sort of government affairs as usual without having figured out that, although this is not government as usual, these are extremists in all these states. You and I talked about this before, pushing extremist, measures of every sort and creating this broader culture of just hatred, hostility, you name it, that those protests are sort of the leading edge of. And so there's a whole chapter in this new book where Disney, I mentioned Kroger or, Procter & Gamble or the Ohio Chamber of Commerce, they've all got to get out of the business of propping up extremists, because that's what they're doing when they give to state house gerrymandered extremists who then pass laws that literally attack their own customers, their own workers, those folks' families, and ultimately, like we see in the business itself. And what I think all these businesses should do is stand up and be counted for democracy. I'm not saying, although, as a Democrat, this would be great. Start just giving a bunch of Democrats, give to people you think stand for democracy. Either way, use your footprint, your corporate footprint. Everyone who enters that Disney park, everyone who watches a Disney movie, you name it, to lift democracy. So as those people come into the park, register them. If you have a company that's in the state with a new strict voter ID law, when they walk through the door, make sure they may know your customers that law, and maybe there's a kiosk where they can take the steps to start getting their photo ID. This isn't Democrat or Republican. It's simply lifting democracy. And I think at this point, rather than giving to these extremists, these businesses, hey, we're going to lift democracy. And quickly, I think that would get us to a better place. And sadly, what Disney's a perfect example. They gave to extremists. The very extremes they gave to passed the Don't Say Gay bill. Their own employees rightfully protested, and that began the entire process that they're now still dealing with today. So just get out of that business and get into the democracy business.
Yeah, legislatures routinely shake down businesses for, people really who don't understand this don't really know what's going on. But legislatures shake down the businesses of their state for campaign contributions, and that is a bipartisan problem. They'll introduce some law. They'll hold a fundraiser. The law will go away. But it's crossed a line. And now the damage, and you point this out, that is just being done even to the folks who donate. I mean, the Republican legislatures in Florida are going after Disney, and oh my gosh, that those poor children have to see these folks in their Nazi regalia on their way in to see Minnie Mouse is just so disgusting.
It's outrageous.
And
it goes broader too. I'm getting very frustrated here in Ohio. We have one terrible bill after the next, including right now an absolute assault on the university education in the state of Ohio. Again, if you are a major business in Ohio, you are counting on Ohio State or University of Cincinnati or Miami or whatever to deliver a whole lot of your workforce. Well, if they're literally doing, and they're trying to do what they've done in Florida here in Ohio, just decimating the basics of what a good university looks like and how it teaches, you should be weighing in at that state house to stop that if you're a major company, because it's gonna crush your future workforce, especially if you value a diverse workforce with women included. And so I just think that these businesses have to, in some of these states, they are still a powerful voice. But too often I think they're kind of shirking and hoping to stay out of the fray when some of the greatest strengths of where they are located are just being winnowed away by the extremism. So I think it's time for people to be counted across the board. If you're not an extremist, if you believe in democracy, being quiet about it right now is not a winning strategy. It's time for everyone, which is most of us, to step up and speak out on this and take action.
I think we're getting closer. I read I have a particular interest in universities, and I read the bill that you just mentioned in Ohio. And just for those of you who are listening, this isn't just a bill that says we won't fund DEI initiatives. As bad as that would be, because you really don't want the legislature telling the university what to do or how to think. But it also says things like every faculty syllabus has to be, right there downloadable so that we can score them. We can look at them to see the balance of liberal versus conservative ideas so that we can take action as a legislature. We want to be able to do that research easily. One click, please. We're going to impose an ideology on universities. And that is what happens in Saudi Arabia, where I worked in universities, and they have lots of money, and the universities aren't any good. And it happens in China, where maybe you can learn some science, but you can't learn any history. Creativity is not going to happen there. So any business in Ohio is worth less because of this. The workforce is not going to be as interesting or as creative, and the science isn't going to be as good. It's really unbelievable.
Yeah,
unbelievable.
Yeah, so that's sort of and so I think there's a big role. There's a big role that can be played if people would step up, and that's why I'm glad Disney's doing. I actually think they have a hell of a First Amendment case against Ron DeSantis. The government of Florida is punishing a company because it expressed a certain viewpoint against some legislation. I think they actually have a very good case to make, and I hope Ron DeSantis send a lot of text messages and other things that help improve their case.
Yep. Okay, so let's talk more about your book. And to begin with, I think the story about why you wrote it.
Yeah, I wrote it. You hinted at it, and I'm sure you and I are always trying to find the right balance between. There's some really terrible things happening in a lot of places. It's not just Marjorie Taylor Greene and George Santos and Donald Trump. It's actually largely where democracy is being attacked and extremism advances in these state houses. And I wrote a book called Laboratories of Autocracy, walking through it in I'd say painful detail. I think the book's easy to read, but the facts are actually painful to read. So I got a lot of feedback from people saying, oh, my God, I liked your book, but, man, it was so hard to read sometimes I had to skip to the end to know what to do about it, because at the end of that book, I go through 30 steps we can all take. And I heard that so much, and when you write, you learn pretty quickly. If readers are saying the same thing again, you better pay attention to it. And I thought, well, you know what? I've seen so many positive things since I wrote the first book. people who've said, hey, here's what I'm trying to do. Here's what I'm doing. Here's what's working in my state, even though it's a pretty red state. I decided, well, let me put together what I'll call a user's manual of what we can do. And so if you read the first book, because we all have to understand the problem. But if you then see if you see that problem in the right context, the truth is there's so many things we can do to help solve it. There's so many things we can do to go on offense, not just in a few places because of a swing state mindset, but because democracy is under attack everywhere, which means we can defend it everywhere. So all of a sudden I lay out in this new book, here are all the things you can do. And I try and use very accessible best practices, a lot of individual stories about everyday people who stepped up and did some great things, trying to show the individual, wherever they are, I don't care, red state, blue state, swing state, there are so many things you can do right now. There are organizations that can help you do those things. You can start small groups in your own community, but the one thing we cannot do is sit here and just watch D.C. and watch the DOJ and watch a few swing states as if that's all we're supposed to be doing. There's a ton we can do right in our own backyards, and that's really the point of the book.
Yeah, and for those of you who haven't encountered David in print, he's a very good writer. I've read a number of his books, including his fiction, because he's also a novelist. So he's a very good writer. It's an easy thing for you to do to read these books. Not easy in the sense that it doesn't make you think, but his writing is clear. And it really, I just can't recommend it enough. Hey, and David, just to give an idea about how also sometimes charming your writing is, you begin this book with a sort of a story that's a history lesson, but also family story. And it's just such great perspective on the long game.
Well, yeah, thank you for saying that about the writing. I appreciate it. I use a lot of my sort of fiction writing skills here. Everything I say is truthful, obviously, but I worry that the topic is both potentially dark, but also, sounds boring to people. What do we do? That I do try and use storytelling to draw it out, and that's why I hope, and I've gotten good feedback that, hey, this stuff's really readable. Thank you. And it helps people get through something that otherwise, and I think this is one of the problems. No one cares about state houses. That's why they're such a great place to attack democracy. No one's paying attention. No one wants to pay attention. So I try and spice it up a little bit with the writing. And that's why I start the book with a story. And it's a story about a woman who was at Seneca Falls for that Women's Rights Convention, century and a half ago. Was only there because she'd been kicked out of another church down the street. So she's a member of the church at the Seneca Falls Convention. And this is a woman who, when you think about her life, she was in her, I think, 42 at that convention. And the point of the story is to say that she didn't ever live, despite 80 years of activism, to see come about. In fact, not even close. The teenagers at Seneca Falls didn't even see it. It would take 2 generations after the woman I mentioned, I'm going to mention her in a second, to actually see it. And the entire point is the battle for democracy is a long game. It's not about one election. It's not about the next election. It's really an intergenerational battle. And that's what we're in today. We're not in some magical moment of only worrying about federal elections every 2 years. We're in the same battle for democracy. And the reason I know so much about this woman I keep talking about is this was my great-great-great-great-grandmother, who I learned from a young age, was at Seneca Falls, did all these great things, and she was kicked out of her original church because she was such a fierce abolitionist. Even an abolitionist church, apparently the pastor was not comfortable, and he kicked her out for what he called conduct unbecoming a woman. So apparently some of this is in my genes. But the point is, and it's the first thing, once you see that we are in a battle for democracy, which we have not seen for too long, one of the quickest conclusions you have to reach is, well, that's a long battle. Plan accordingly. Wage it accordingly. Don't do what we've been doing for the last couple of decades, which is only focus on federal races, only focus for a few months out of a 2-year cycle, take everything apart after each election, only to rebuild it, 18 months later. That's all how you lose when the other side is on offense against democracy all the time. So that's sort of, I use her to really sort of paint the picture about what it's looked like in our history, whether it be John Lewis or suffragists. When you're battling for democracy, it's all the time, which by the way, shouldn't be just sobering. It can be inspiring because it means, like Stacey Abrams in Georgia, you can see progress even in tough times if you're thinking about the right way and doing it the right way.
It's a lovely story, and it just goes to the way you write. And so those of you who are listening, go find David Pepper and look up his books on Amazon or wherever you buy your books. It's very worth the read. Hey, one of those recommendations in the book is to reframe the conversation around the democracy. You mentioned it a minute ago. Now, for a lot of folks aren't like you and me. The democracy isn't the thing that they think about all day long. But you have done a really good job of tying together the democracy with those other issues that animate our politics in any given moment, whether that's abortion rights or a polluted river or a corrupt deal, to sell off your schools.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the key insights that I hit even harder in the beginning of this new book is the reason they are attacking democracy, from Mitch McConnell to the Koch brothers to these state houses. The reason they gerrymander, the reason in Ohio they're trying to change the Constitution to increase the threshold to amend it to 60%. They do that because they know that for the most part, their entire agenda is deeply unpopular. So they're advancing an unpopular agenda. It's much more extreme than mainstream American values, even in states like Kansas or Texas, where those are pro-choice states, despite these legislatures. But so one thing you will see in these hijacked states is total extremism out of touch with the mainstream values of the states, and that's one way to connect back to people. And one of the reasons I think Democrats obviously had such a good 22, I'm not the only one to say this, is the Dobbs decision and the immediate triggering of these abortion bans in all these states really put a direct issue forward as a tangible example of what their attack on democracy means for people. And that's why a lot of the Secretary of State candidates, election deniers, who ran, almost every one of them, all of them lost in swing states. And a lot of the ads against them were literally about, hey, they are not for fair elections, but they're also against abortion access. And so you want to start to not just say democracy is at risk, and that's going to concern some people, but democracy is at risk because they want to advance something that the majority doesn't agree with. And name the things that they are trying to advance, like abortion bans, no exception. The other thing I try and point out is in these states that are hijacked, these red states that are hijacked by extremists, once you live, and I go through this in this book in more detail than the first, in many of these states, these people do not even face contested elections. 50% of the Tennessee Republicans who voted out the two of the Tennessee three, the two Justins, didn't even face an opponent last year. In Texas, the numbers were off the chart. Florida and Georgia, state for state, we have a crisis not only of gerrymandering, but of people not facing elections at all. In many states, they simply canceled them. And I go through in the book what that does to our notions of public service. It works public service, where they don't worry about the voters at all because they're guaranteed to stay in power, and they worry far more about the private sector players that are pushing to get things from them from the public trough. And what that means, this is a long way to get to the answer, but it's important to think about it this way. What that means is it's going to mean an inevitable decline in public outcomes that everyday people care about. Rural schools collapsing as those rural legislators vote to give away all the money. A rural broadband being stopped from happening because private utilities and telecom didn't want it to happen, so the legislators go along with the plan instead of going along with their voters. On and on, there's some really powerful examples that you can connect that lack of democracy in your state to everyday issues that people are thinking about if they're not thinking about the state of democracy. You know, you've probably, in some of our interviews, you've heard my kids in the background. I have a 9 and a 6-year-old. They are now on summer vacation. For families, that poses a difficulty. So when you start saying to a lot of families in some of these states, you only have 4 days of school a week because they so underfunded the public school system, they had to cancel all the Fridays. That's a crisis. It isn't partisan, but it's connected to the lack of democracy, because the lack of democracy is what's creating these terrible public outcomes. So my guess is almost everywhere in this country, in these broken places, there is extremism that you can tie to the lack of democracy, and there also are indefensible public outcomes. You know, main streets that are collapsing, infrastructure that's not there, schools that are collapsing, and that's all connected back to the fact that they've removed all accountability from politics by their nonstop attack on democracy. Those are a lot of the issues I focus on as you try and talk about all this happening at the same time.
Yep. And I think there's, in this last bit, you've been talking about the public outcomes. There's another thing that drives people crazy that I think, and you make this case as well, is related to gerrymandering. Candidates who are in gerrymandered districts do face elections, but they're primary elections. They're not general elections. So it encourages radicalization. It encourages folks to move to extremes. And you hear people all the time complain about polarization in America. That is an outcome of these crooked districts.
Absolutely. I mean, there are multiple incentives that get totally screwed up once you have these rigged gerrymandered systems where you even have half of these people not face a general election. One incentive is you stop worrying about public outcomes and you start worrying about outcomes for Brett Favre or the big utility or some other private player, and you pad those outcomes by grabbing from public resources. But the other one is, in a competitive district, you actually have an incentive to be mainstream. You would lose if you ran around being extremist if you had a 50-50 district in November. But once that election doesn't even happen anymore, or something you never worry about, then yeah, the only incentive you face is to be an extremist. Let's go back to Tennessee for a second. When 50% of those Tennessee Republicans do not face a general election, they are literally rewarded by kicking out the 2 Justins. That is how they get ahead in their screwed up world. They need to be extremists to avoid a primary. If they were to vote to keep their colleagues in that legislature, they would risk losing that next primary, because in that primary, a Republican would come along and say, oh, the so-and-so voted with the Democrat to keep to the 2 Justins, and therefore they're a rhino. So in these worlds with no accountability come November, they literally, if they aren't already this way to begin with, and some are, maybe aren't, they actually feel all the pressure in the world of being an extremist, even if they don't agree with it. And that's how they get ahead in every way, you know, the current office, the next office, you name it. And if they ever cross over to be more mainstream or to vote for some common sense, that's literally how they'll lose. Yeah. And that's why everywhere you go, like especially where you have all these uncontested races and terrible gerrymandering, it is a downward spiral of extremism, because that's what the incentives reward these people for doing. And that's
it's also a full-time job for federal prosecutors, because they undoubtedly end up crossing the line because it rewards giving private people public goods, and you end up with public corruption all over the place. So let's just take some time, because I can't not do it, and turn to, the sort of news of the day, because there's so much of it. And can we start with Ohio and the campaign for reproductive choice in Ohio, which led to a backlash that has now a bizarre August referendum to change the Constitution so that Ohioans can't change the Constitution? Can you make sense of this for us?
Yeah. So basically, as I said, these just from the bigger picture way, these legislators are living in a gerrymandered world, no accountability, and wherever they fear accountability may come their way, they try and stop it. And in some places, that's attacking courts. In other places, it's stripping power from governors. In other places like Iowa near you, they recently tried to strip power away from the Democratic state auditor. In Ohio, and this is true in other places too, they know that perhaps the only check remaining on their power are the people themselves, who can change the Constitution in Ohio through a referendum and collecting signatures with 50%. And when they know that abortion is the popular view in Ohio, we're about a 59% pro-choice state. The biggest threat to their extremism, since it's not gerrymandering, since it's not an Ohio Supreme Court, the biggest threat to their extremism in their gerrymandered world is the people rallying to say, not on our watch are you going to ban abortion, no exceptions. People started gathering those signatures 4 months ago. It's clearly got a lot of energy. So they went forward, and they are pushing to change the rules of how we amend the Constitution to lift the threshold to 60% because they know 50% would win. But even more egregious than that, which is already really bad, they are scheduling it in August to get ahead of what is a November referendum on abortion rights. And they're doing it even though only months ago they banned the ability to have an August special election. So the election literally is illegal under the Ohio Revised Code. They didn't have the votes to reverse that law that made it illegal. So they're simply demanding an election on the day that it is currently illegal, and this is currently being combated at the Ohio Supreme Court. So what I try and point out, the lawlessness builds on itself. It's a gerrymandered legislature itself that violates the Constitution, pushing to change the Constitution a different way and doing it on a date where that election actually at this point is illegal. But they will do anything to cut off any check on their power. In this case, that check is the people themselves. And that's what we're fighting. So we have court cases. My guess is because our Supreme Court is frankly very much of a similar mindset. Because they changed the rules on that. That court will go along with it, and so we have to beat it. And now the good news is, I think we can. And my hope is we take that moment to build some momentum to then roll right on through to November and protect a woman's right to choose in Ohio. So I think like Kansas, which had this great victory about a year ago, when they had a referendum on abortion on their ballot, I think we can do the same here. But it's just a great example. Never underestimate the lawless lengths these people will go to stay in power and to pursue an extremist agenda. They know that if there was a straight up healthy Democratic vote on the right to choose Ohio, they know it wouldn't even be close. So they have to change the rules in advance.
Yeah, it's really appalling. And I mean, there's so many good people in Ohio. Y'all deserve so much better than this. It's just heartbreaking. Heartbreaking.
David, it really is. It goes back to what I said before. It pulls our state backwards in so many ways. Just the quality of life, the attraction of young, talented working businesses, or even go to schools here. We have wonderful schools. Oberlin, Ohio State, OU, you name it. Wonderful schools that draw kids from all over the country.
Including my own. One went to Oberlin. I had a kid graduate from Oberlin. One of mine went to Oberlin. Great. I mean,
so this has impacts, on day-to-day life here, but it has impacts long-term on our competitiveness. And this Ohio legislature is choosing to move in a direction that makes us a far less attractive place to future generations.
Columbus is a fast-growing, interesting, attractive city, and if they pass this higher ed law in the language that I read it, it'll all go the other direction.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely.
Well, this wasn't the only news. Earlier in the show, before you got on, I talked about, among other things, the case of Allen versus Milligan, where I think Justice Roberts looked into at America, and he said, "Oh my God, I'm going to be the Chief Justice whose court was corrected by Congress when they expanded the number of judges and forced ethics rules upon us, and maybe even reversed Marbury versus Madison. We are that that unpopular. I better reverse my thinking and okay this law, this voting rights law that I, by the way, put off so it wouldn't be effective in this election. You've looked at the impact of this decision they just made, and it's a very salubrious impact, a very good result.
Yeah. Well, first of all, by the way, in law school, I wrote a long law review paper that got published. I think it was in the Marquette Law Journal.
Look at this. You're a published author in every kind of writing.
But this was an article about how the threat to court pack by FDR led to a change in approach by the court that could not be explained through the legal process. And that was and there was a whole debate about whether that was sort of an internal evolution of the law or politics. And my paper was saying, if you read all the cases and how they had handled until that switch, clearly politics was involved. So it's interesting that this thing I wrote when I was like 25 is now coming back, and it's what you just described. That case, this was a case that again, you said I'm an optimist. I thought this case was going to be a terrible blow. The area of the law that this case dealt with, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, revolutionized this country's politics once he came upon standards that said you can't divide black communities into little pieces that basically negate black representation, which was basically how they had kept almost zero black representatives and members of Congress for decades, or obviously for all of Jim Crow. They just divided these communities up. And once the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 said, if there's a large black community such that it could lead to a district with a black representative, you can't split it up. And if it would lead to two districts, you can't split it up so it only has one. And the argument in this, Alabama was caught blatantly violating this, which Georgia and Louisiana also were doing in 21. And Alabama was caught so badly in doing it, it couldn't defend the map under the standards that we've had for decades. It tried to basically convince five of them these standards are not valid. We have to go back to sort of a Clarence Thomas view that we shouldn't have rule at all. That literally, if you go back in time, took zero representation of black communities by black representatives and totally changed it. And my great fear was that we were going to go back to the old days and go and risk. And as you said, it was a shock to me when the 5-4 vote came the other way. I thought that this would be the quiet case that would do a lot of damage while everyone focuses on Moore v. Harper, this other big case that we could talk about. But John Roberts, to his credit, and Kavanaugh held firm and said, "Nope, we're not abandoning the standard that literally has revolutionized representation in America." So what that does is it means that in the next coming months, districts that are probably going to be found illegal in Georgia, Louisiana, and Alabama will have to be redrawn. That could lead to at least three or more new seats that Democrats should be able to win. Now, the question, like everything else, is how long does this take? But even more important, long term, it preserves this last protection against the worst kind of gerrymandering. And if they had won the case the right, they would have set about doing this everywhere. So it doesn't just sort of preserve the protection. It stops what could have been the splitting of communities all over the country to go back in time, not only to reduce black representation to where it is now, but to totally, rig the results so the Republicans would have had an artificial majority going into every congressional race. So every sort of cycle. So it's a
race-based artificial
it preserves
majority.
A massive protection. Yeah. And by the way, just to be clear, their current majority, not all of it, but a lot of their current majority is coming out of districts that were frozen in place as we waited for this decision. Those districts will now be redrawn. So it's already an artificial majority that they basically were waiting for this case to determine. They're going to have to redraw these districts going forward.
Yeah, and David, they had this case in February of the year before the election. So and the election was in November. February of that year, they said, oh, it's too close to the election. We're going to wait till after. So the Supreme Court forced the country to be living with districts that are plainly unconstitutional, even for this court. And Judge Roberts, I want to give him some credit, but he's the guy who wrote when he started to dismantle the Voting Rights Act and he got rid of pre-clearance for changes. Oh, times have changed and no one will ever go backwards and try and write race-based districts. And he was proven wrong before the ink was dry.
Yeah, and by the way, these districts, if you had Shelby County not happened, these districts wouldn't have been allowed already because they had a pre-clearance process that would have stopped them. So this Section 2 was the final break. And when I say break, I mean BRAKE, the final break on gerrymandering that felt like it was going down. I mean, when they froze these maps, it was so clearly problematic to take the case. And the Alabama argument, and I went through this I teach voting rights in the fall. I went through this with the class. I mean, this was a completely rogue argument that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act was supposed to be race neutral. The entire purpose was to stop racism. You can't have a test that's race neutral when the whole purpose is to stop racist gerrymandering. But they were, and if you read Justice Thomas's dissent, he basically took this rogue Alabama argument, said that should be the law, and whatever the motivation, and I agree with you, Shelby County would have kept this from getting this far if it hadn't been decided the way it had. Roberts, the argument by Alabama was clearly just too much. Now, one thing I always worry about is not to get too superstitious, but for a number of years, the end of these Supreme Court terms, there's always some cases we feel good about, and then at the same moment, there's some case we feel terrible about. So what I'm really pulling for here is that we go 2 for 2, and that we win this one, and then Moore v. Harper, which is the independent state legislative case that's also we're still waiting on, that either that gets kicked because it's moot, or once again, it's such a rogue argument that Roberts and Kavanaugh can't go along with it. This is the case that would basically say state courts can't review the work of state legislatures, which would, again, be so counter to the rule of law and so counter to basic democracy. So hopefully we go 2 for 2, because a split here, if we win one and lose one, that loss would be a devastating loss for a lot of states.
I think that loss, if they take up Moore versus Harper, which is clearly now moot, but if they take it up anyway, because why not? Standing be damned. And they affirm this bizarre, crazy doctrine, then this will be the only thing in American democracy where there are no checks and balances. Seems an odd, the founders spent a lot of time on that issue, but why not make voting the only thing that doesn't have it? But I think it would, in addition to making what the legislatures do unreviewable by state Supreme Courts, I think it would also make things like the independent commissions that vote that have been put in place in states like Michigan that made such a huge difference in their legislative districts. I think that would go away too.
Yeah, no, it would. And the other thing it does is it also means if you amend your constitution around voting, and the court of a state is supposed to be the protector of the Constitution, well, if the court no longer is because of that theory, it means the people change the Constitution ends up being decided by the legislature anyway. So, yeah, it would be a real blow to any notions of a democracy in these states. But again, if you had asked me 6 months ago, I would have said they're going to go along with Alabama, even though that's a horrible and rogue argument. But Moore v. Harper is even more rogue. It's even more sort of unprincipled. So I always thought that was actually the worst case. So my hope is, knock on wood, this isn't sort of the good news versus bad news to come. My hope is we win both, or at least they kick it because the North Carolina case has been mooted. But we'll see. I mean, these are all so perilous that honestly, they go back to sort of the beginning. Like, we shouldn't be living sort of right on the edge of a healthy democracy or a broken one as we are. But these days, that's exactly where we are. And these cases could have massive impacts.
Well, but again, I to go back to your law school law review paper, I think that America's fury at the Supreme Court, the fact that the Chicago City Council is more trusted than the U.S. Supreme Court, should say something to them that should be meaningful, because I think they are human beings, and that's got to weigh on them, and maybe it'll weigh on 5 of them. Not Alito, not ever, not Thomas, not ever. I guess not Amy Coney Barrett, who's been showing her stripes here. We have some religion cases coming up that are going to be awful too. All right, there's one more. We have 5 minutes left. It goes by quickly, but there is one other story this week. That little indictment down in Florida, and I just want to get your. I know everybody. I haven't talked about it on this show today really very much, and people, it is what they want to talk about. Let's just talk about what do you think? This is a chance for people to take the off ramp. Right? If they say, I didn't know it was so bad. Oh, my gosh, I couldn't have imagined, like Claude Rains in Casablanca saying, I'm shocked there was gambling in there. We'll welcome them back to reality. We won't make them pay too big a price. We'll say, welcome back to the real world. But they're not going to take that off ramp, are they?
No, they're already engaging in complete disinformation that he's being mistreated, different for everyone else. I did a little whiteboard on this morning. When you read through the indictment, it's a quick read. This is when you hear 50 pages, it's about 25. It's double spaced. I recommend people read it, but there are a couple moments in it that are really off the charts. Obviously we expect it to be highly classified documents. That does happen in other cases when it's an accident. But the minute the subpoena, first of all, it's bizarre. It's being stored in all these bizarre places like the bathroom and the shower. But even the most incriminating part is the initial effort to convince his lawyers to lie about it. And when his lawyers, to their credit, said, no, we actually have to come and get the documents on this date, that's when he and this one guy who's also in trouble with him literally began just removing boxes again and again and again and again, and then said to the lawyers, hey, here's the storage room. This is all that we had. It's a complete and absolute lie. This guy is clearly just sort of a serial criminal, and this is how it came out in this case. And then they go to the DOJ and say this is all that we had. Absolutely egregious. And when people say, well, this is not fair. Well, if there was another case where all this happened and that person wasn't indicted, I agree it wouldn't happen, because these facts are just so over the top about, clear intention to deceive, ultimately lying back to the DOJ, and full knowledge that he had not declassified these documents on tape. It is a truly bizarre several months that you read about, and it does make you realize, Trump just isn't disturbing in so many ways, and there's something off when it comes to just sort of the basic intelligence that he thought he was going to get away with moving boxes all over the place after a DOJ subpoena when there's surveillance of it all, or there's a reporter taping him. And when a reporter
he's showing them classified documents.
Yeah, and he says to them, with the tape running, and it's running, it's normally sitting on the table in front of you, hey, I shouldn't be showing this because I can declassify it. This is why I think, this is not a very smart person we're talking about. And that combination with going along with a complete sense of lack of accountability, he walked himself right to indictment. You couldn't not indict. You couldn't.
No, I think they had no choice. I think the rule of law and our entire sort of national security apparatus requires an indictment in a case like this. Yeah.
What's interesting
we'll
is
see if the Republicans will walk away. They just this is not going to get better.
It really is stunning that they do this, and this is why I hope Chris Christie gets on the debate stage. I hope Asa Hutchinson. I think it's healthy for the country if those debates don't turn into just all disinformation. Which right now, if you listen to DeSantis or Nikki Haley or Kevin McCarthy, it's all disinformation. Acting as if this is no big deal, acting like this is being done to cover for Biden, which I think Marsha Blackburn said of Tennessee. I mean, they are all engaged in really dangerous propaganda. And so to have anyone running the Republican side, not because they think they're going to win, but just to add some truth to the conversation is a huge service at this point.
Yeah. David, as always, it's really great to catch up, and congratulations on the new book. Everybody, please find David's books, buy them. They're clear, they're important, and they will help you do the job we need you to do. Thanks, David. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Always good. Always great catching up. See you soon.
Take care. Bye. Bye. All right, everybody, a break from the news, and then you know what? We're going to be joined by a Nobel Prize winner. Stay tuned.